External fertilization.
Good. So regarding animals, reproduction. Very good. And so what else did we go through? At all? We'll maybe move to Matthew. What else did we cover last week, Matthew?
We covered hormones.
Very
Yeah, and fallopian.
Very good. So those are the two main features, right? So, and could you just remind the class, when we talk about internal and external fertilization, first of all, what kind of animal engages in internal and what kind of animal engages in external?
So was that Anne?
Yes, and.
Okay.
Yeah.
So external fertilization is more for like aquatic animals, and then for internal, it's more terrestrial ones.
Okay, very good. And moving on to Sarah. Sarah, where exactly does fertilization happen in internal fertilization? Anatomically in the female reproductive tract, where does it occur?
It occurs in the fallopian tube.
Very good, right? The outer 1/3 of the fallopian tube. You can see that in this image right there. Right outside the border of the fallopian tube, right here, is where fertilization can happen. It does not always happen, but it definitely can happen. And Alyssa, what is the definition of fertilization?
The fusion of the gametes to form zygote.
Very good. Fusion of gametes to form zygote. Very good. You're doing really well. Nathania, coming back to you, talk about hormones and pregnancy. How would you define a hormone? If it was a 1-mark question in an exam, what would you say? Nathania?
A chemical messenger for the body.
Good. And where does it travel?
And travels through the bloodstream.
Perfect. Right? Good. Now, Matthew, a bit of an extension question. Where do hormones come from? And do you know which structures of the body are important in controlling levels of hormones?
So first starts in the hypothalamus in your brain that sends signals to pituitary gland that releases hormones into your bloodstream that binds to receptors in other organs and all that. Yeah.
Perfect. Right? Exactly what I wanted to hear, which is hormones originate from glands. And we need to have very tight control of hormones because whenever you have an imbalance, you have some kind of disease, right? If you have an imbalance of growth hormone, you would have a condition called acromegaly, or if you haven't grown to full adulthood, you would have gigantism, right? So the tallest people that have existed in history actually had a tumor in their brain, exactly in the structure we're talking about, where too much growth hormone was released and they grow to be excessively tall. That also has a lot of complications as well, right? Increased cancer risk, etc. As long as you understand, hormones need to be in very tight control. And we spoke about this axis. Do you guys remember the axis we spoke about? This is a little diagram that we use. And I told you, if you understand this diagram, you understand the structures which are releasing hormones. This flowchart, which they haven't asked yet in hormones and pregnancy ever in the HSC, so definitely think would be on the balls for you guys. This will be much more understandable. Right now, it should just look like a bunch of squiggly lines that are changing with time, and you can see a few things are happening in sync when things are spiking, but we will digest and break this down. For that, you need to truly understand this little flowchart here. Now, has anyone seen this year's HSC Bio exam? A lot of my students told me about the exam, and one of them actually leaked me the paper, but has anyone seen it yet? Okay, I will show you the... Oh, you have, Matthew?
Yes.
Good, good. I'll pull it up and I'll show you guys what the exam looks like so you can start to appreciate in 360-ish days where you will need to be at to do well and smash that exam, right? So look at the kind of questions they ask because it gives you a window into how you need to think for science. But coming back to this, I think Matthew highlighted this quite well, which is the hypothalamus in the center of the brain is the master controller of hormones. All hormones originate there. They'll then travel in the bloodstream and act on other sites. And those other sites will release hormones that will then travel in the bloodstream and act on other sites, right? So this hormone GnRH, bit of a question to you all. In your bodies, when did GnRH start to be released? bit of a challenge question, but I want you to think outside the box. We're talking about pregnancy. We're talking about testosterone, progesterone. When does a human reach the age where they can start to release hormones and they start secondary sexual development? At all? Gotta answer this one. I can't hear you. I think your mic isn't working, but yes, your mic definitely isn't working. So just get onto that, and I will move on to Edward. What do you call that phase where a child begins development and hormonal changes to adulthood?
Puberty.
Puberty, right? It's interesting. We have no idea what causes this to happen, but somehow at about age 9 onwards in females, at about age 10, 11, it's a bit later in males, you suddenly start to get the release of GnRH, this hormone, and it sets off the cascade that begins development into adulthood, right? That is what causes puberty at a biochemical level. If I got a little kid, I injected them with this hormone, they will start puberty. That's the science behind it, right? So what does this word mean, Anne? We said gonadotropin-releasing hormone. It's a fancy word, but how would you teach your friend as to what that word means?
I would say, so gonads are organs which produce gametes. So I would say it's a hormone that tells the organs that produce gametes to start releasing more hormones that release to other things.
Good. Very close. I really like that. That was a very good breakdown. So it acts on the gonads, which are the testes in males and the ovary in females, right? Tropin means change, right? Tropism is changing. Releasing hormone, what this is telling you is gonadotropin releasing hormone is going to release gonadotropins. So GnRH is actually not going to the gonads. It's going to another structure to cause the release of gonadotropins. Gonadotropins are the hormones that will then go to the gonads. So another little image here, what you see is GnRH is not going to the gonads, it's going to the pituitary, which is still in the brain. It's that little sac-like structure in the brain, right? And then it causes the release of gonadotropins. We have two gonadotropins. LH, which stands for luteinizing hormone. I need you guys to say this with me, because otherwise you will not remember, understand any of this, right? Someone speaks to you in another language, if you cannot, say the word back, you're not going to remember it. So luteinizing hormone is LH, right? And you see the spelling there as well. And follicle stimulating hormone is FSH. Those are the two hormones that are released from the pituitary, and they're released from the action of GnRH. Now, they will then travel from your brain. I want you to point at your brain just so you know the literal physical distance. They'll go from the brain all the way below the digestive system to the gonads. So you can see that's at least, 50 centimeters, 70 centimeters, a long distance in the body, right? Travels in the bloodstream, and then will act on the gonads to cause the release of hormones. In our case, hormones in pregnancy, which we are studying. So does everyone understand the cascade that causes a release of estrogen and progesterone in the gonads, right? GnRH, hypothalamus, it travels very short distance to the pituitary, which is a little structure in the brain as well. And that will then release LH and FSH that travels very far in the bloodstream to the testes, right? Or the ovary in females, since we're looking at pregnancy. And that causes the release of estrogen and progesterone. Now, what is the additional hormone that is released in males? It's also released in females, and it's very important, but it's released much more in males. It's the one I rubbed at here. It says androgens in this flowchart. Does anyone know what hormone androgens refer to? Androgens is a group. What is the main androgen? Any ideas?
Is it testosterone?
Testosterone, right? It's testosterone. Very good. And testosterone has a whole load of effects, as you know, right? It increases muscle tissue. It affects bone density, but too much testosterone causes a lot of problems like cancer. It all gets converted to estrogen, so you get increased abdominal fat. It also causes acne, a lot of side effects. So that's your androgens, but we're not going to talk about that. It's not relevant for the HSC, just so you understand this flowchart. Now, what haven't I explained here? You see something very interesting happening here, guys. This feature is universal to chemistry, biology, and physics. It's nature's way of controlling itself. What is estrogen going and doing? So I want you to forget about the plus sign, because that's very rare, and it only happens in very specific scenarios. But if you saw a flowchart like this, what is your understanding of that arrow that's going back up and the negative sign? Let's go to Alyssa. Alyssa, what's your understanding of what's going on there? So what is that estrogen doing? Yeah.
Sorry, I think
Any ideas?
what am I?
So what is this telling you? How are you interpreting this? That's okay. I'll go to Matthew. Matthew, what's your understanding of what's going on here?
It's a feedback loop to the hypothalamus.
Very good. And what kind of feedback? Is it positive? Or it kind of has the sign, right? But so to say, negative feedback, right? Negative feedback, you see this in chemistry. Can you guys hit the raise hand icon if you do chemistry? Right? Okay, a few of you, not everyone, but if I say the word Le Chatelier's principle to chemistry students, hopefully you'll understand that's literally negative feedback with chemical reactions. In biology, negative feedback happens all the time, and it's how the body maintains internal balance. If I go and put you in Greenland, where it's actually icy, unlike Iceland, it's very cold, you'll start to shiver, your hairs will raise, right? And that will start generating heat, and you'll counteract a decreasing body temperature, right? In the same way, at a hormonal level, we are exerting what's called negative feedback. It's body's way of controlling itself. So what you can all appreciate is happening is if I tell you that the hypothalamus is always releasing GnRH, and that GnRH is always linked to the pituitary and increasing LH and FSH, and that FSH is continually going to the gonads and causing a continual increase in estrogen and progesterone, what would you expect estrogen levels to do over time? Forget out this whole negative feedback loop, just based on that fact. And what would you expect to happen to estrogen and progesterone levels over time in the human body if it's continually being secreted and released?
It would increase over time.
Yeah, it'd start to increase exponentially, right? And that is not good. Too much estrogen, breast cancer, ovarian cancer, a lot of problems, right? In fact, when a woman has breast cancer, we check for estrogen receptor status to see, is this breast cancer being caused by increased estrogen levels, right? It's that dangerous. So my point is, this cannot happen or a person will die. So what the body does is the estrogen that is made goes back to the brain and tells the brain to stop releasing GnRH at the hypothalamus. And that's what this part of negative feedback is telling you. And it goes to the pituitary and it tells the pituitary to stop releasing LH and FSH. So let's think about what happens then, right? So increasing estrogen will then go back and it will tell GnRH to reduce. It'll tell the LH and FSH at the pituitary to reduce. And so since there's less LH and FSH, there's less estrogen that's going to be produced. And so instead of seeing a graph like this, what happens is estrogen increases, and the increasing estrogen levels exert negative feedback, and it will start to plateau in its increase, or even in fact, it will start to decrease. Right? So when estrogen levels get too high, they exert more negative feedback, increased negative feedback, and they go back down. But let's go to Rithania. So now estrogen levels have started to plummet. There's less estrogen. If there's less estrogen, what will happen to the amount of negative feedback that estrogen exerts on the hypothalamus and pituitary, Rithania? Will it increase or decrease when there's lower estrogen levels?
Decrease.
Decrease. So now there's less negative feedback. There's less inhibition of GnRH, less inhibition of LH and FSH. So they will start to increase again. And when they increase, estrogen will also increase. So what you're appreciating is when estrogen levels are low, there's less negative feedback, it'll start to increase again, right? Which is the bottom part. When there's low estrogen, the low estrogen means there's less negative feedback. There'll be more GnRH, there'll be more LH and FSH, and estrogen starts to increase again. And over time, if I was to measure a person's estrogen, progesterone, in fact, any hormone level, you'll see it kind of moving up and down like a ping pong ball, right? You guys ever seen those, automatic ping pong ball games on computers where the ball just goes, hits up, hits back down, hits back up, and then hits back down, right? And that's exactly what happens to estrogen levels over time. In fact, any hormone level over time. That is what a graph should look like when negative feedback is happening. And a lot of exam questions will test you on this. They'll say, body temperature over time, what should the graph look like? And it should always have this little fluctuation because of negative feedback. It'll never, ever be, everyone, perfectly horizontal, right? It'll always be fluctuating up and down. Now, does anyone have any questions about negative feedback? It's a very important principle. It's a way of auto-correcting yourself. It's very interesting.
Is that only when fertilization doesn't occur, or is it all the time?
This is all the time.
Okay.
And then fertilization is a special event, and unique things happen in fertilization. So we haven't actually spoken about all that. This is just normally in a person when all those unique things are not happening. This is what the hormone level should look like. However, when then I take you through fertilization, when I take you through implantation, you'll see the hormone levels start changing. But this is the background. This is what's always happening. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Good. Does anyone have any other questions? Good. You should all have a ton of questions, right? Because with bio, I remember always asking my teacher, like non-stop, to the point where it's like you're trying to get every nitty-gritty detail, but it helps a lot. You should be asking questions in science. Good. All right, so this is just a little table in your notes about what these hormones do. And I'm going to come back to that. Right? We'll talk about what estrogen, what progesterone, etc. do. In fact, I'll mention it now. Now, we're talking about hormones and pregnancy, right? Let's go back to this little diagram up here. This diagram will tell you what hormones and pregnancy do. Just got to pull it up. Yes. This diagram. Yeah. Okay, so we're taking a step away from hormones for a moment. We're looking at what actually happens structurally in pregnancy, right? So who remembers how long a normal reproductive cycle is for a female? Like, it varies, but this is a general rule of thumb. What would be the cycle length?
28 days.
Very good. Thanks, Ed. So it'll be 28 days. And Ed, follow-up question. What day does ovulation happen in this 28-day cycle?
Around day 7.
14. Right smack bang in the middle, you will get ovulation. Now, interesting fact, cycles can vary, 31 days, 32 days in females as well. But what's interesting is the second part of the cycle is always 14. So if a female has a 31-day cycle, to find the day of ovulation, it's actually 31 days minus 14. So that would be day 617, right? For ovulation to occur. We found that that second part of the cycle is always constant at 14 days. Let's just very briefly just talk about what is day 1, what is day 28. Like they're very arbitrary times. Day 1 is the first day of menses or menstruation. The first day of menstruation is day 1. Day 14 is ovulation. And ideally, if there are spermatozoa, right, they'll fertilize the ova one day or during the time of ovulation. Day 28 is just the last day right before day 1 of the next cycle, right? So if menstruation happens, the day before that was the last day of the previous menstrual cycle. This is important because in graphs, you'll need to look. Let me just show you the graph, right? You'd have no idea what day 1, day 14 means unless you understand the event that marks day 1, which is menstruation. Okay, and we'll talk about why all of this happens relating to hormones. It's very interesting as to how the body just controls everything. It's on autopilot mode, right? If you were in charge of controlling the dates here, I can't even plan my week, let alone, entire complex cycle to produce potentially life. So we've got ovulation. We said after about 1 day, fertilization may happen. More than often in real life, as we all know, fertilization does not always happen every single reproductive cycle. It's very rare, right? And usually when it happens, it gives rise to an offspring. Now, 7 days after fertilization, what happens? So we'll move to Sarah. So what is this diagram telling you is happening 7 days after fertilization? What process is going on?
Implantation.
Very good. And where is the implantation happening?
It's happening on the outer one-third of the fallopian tube.
Okay, now this is a very, very important point. Edward, does implantation happen in the fallopian tube?
No.
Okay. Now, if you look at this image, right, the fallopian tube is here. Okay. Now, what you're all learning is knowledge that every single doctor will have to use in their lifetime, at least when they're working in emergency medicine. In a woman who's missed menses or their menstrual cycle and potentially are pregnant, if they ever come in with abdominal pain, the scariest diagnosis that would make a doctor really, really worried for that patient's life is if implantation happened in the fallopian tube. And is a fallopian tube big? Like, do you think it's big enough to handle a 3.5 kilo fetus versus the entire wall of the uterine cavity? Big or small?
It's small.
Very small. So if you have implantation there and the fetus grows and grows and grows, and remember, right underneath tissue, as you all know, there's rich blood vessels, right? If you had implantation in the fallopian tube and the fetus keeps growing, it'll eventually rupture the entire fallopian tube, perforate the blood vessel, and you'll get massive internal bleeding, and the mother will die, and so will the child within minutes. Right? So it's so important to highlight that implantation, the location of implantation, which is not the fallopian tube, it's the wall of the uterus. Right? So implantation occurs in the wall of the uterus. If it occurs in the fallopian tube, it's called an ectopic pregnancy, which is, for those who go on to do medicine, that will be one of your main diagnoses in any pregnant woman with abdominal pain. Good. I just wanted to highlight this because I use the knowledge that you're learning now when I see patients in the emergency department, right? And it's the difference between life and death for some of them. Good. Coming back to this, we spoke about implantation. Now, the reason I mentioned the location is so important is because, as you know, there's going to be a massive amount of mitosis that is going to convert this little clump of cells into a 3.5 kilo fetus, a newborn. Now, what resources do we need for this little clump of cells to grow into a full-grown fetus? Let's go to Atul. Hopefully your mic works, Atul. What resources do you need to give this clump of cells to grow it into a full fetus?
Energy and nutrients.
Good, but nutrients is vague, right? I need you to tell me what specific nutrients a human organism needs. What kind of energy? Matthew, move on to you. What nutrients would this? Think about what nutrients we need every day. What do we eat? So Matthew, take it away.
Carbs and proteins.
Very good. Glucose, proteins. What are we breathing that's 21% concentration in the air around us right now?
Oxygen.
Oxygen as well, right? So as you understand, this site of implantation needs to be really, really rich in glucose, really, really rich in proteins, and rich in oxygen, so this clump of cells can grow to a fetus. If it is not sufficiently rich in that, the pregnancy will not proceed. You will get a miscarriage or termination of pregnancy, right? And I'll give you all quite a scary statistic. 1 in 5 pregnancies will end in a miscarriage, and it's because of some kind of issue in the processes that we are looking at now. So it's so important to understand what's needed, because when things like that happen, you have to start thinking as a doctor about what could have caused it. Is it a hormonal imbalance? Was there not enough estrogen? Was there not enough progesterone? So now that you understand, the wall or the lining of the uterus needs to be very, very rich in glucose, in water, in nutrients, you must be wondering, well, what ensures that this lining of the uterus is rich in oxygen, nutrients, glucose, etc.? And the hormone that's responsible for that is estrogen. The job of estrogen is to thicken the lining of the uterus. This is probably the most important point in hormones in pregnancy. Estrogen thickens the lining of the uterus. Now, what do we call the lining of the uterus? It has a specific name. Any ideas what this name is?
The endometrium.
Very good. I want you all from now on, you're not going to call it the uterine lining. You're all Band 6 students. Some of you may even go on to get a state rank. For that, you need to start talking in scientific jargon, right? The endometrium. Very good. Endometrium. Good. So estrogen thickens the endometrium and it increases the glucose and nutrients within it. That is what estrogen does. Now, who remembers what structure releases estrogen? Think about that little flow chart about the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and then think about where did that estrogen come from? And I'll move to Alyssa for this. Alyssa, where does estrogen come from?
Ovary.
Very good, but where exactly in the ovary? I'll zoom in here and I'll get Sarah. I want you to tell me, Sarah, where in the ovary is the estrogen coming from? Any ideas? So is it from the ova itself? Is it from the fluid around the ova? Is it from this outer cells of the follicle?
I'm not too sure, but I think it's from the follicle.
Perfect, nailed it, right? It's from this lining cells, the follicle. So you might remember I showed you last lesson that follicle is not just liquid and an ova. That black ring that I've shown you consists of hormonally active cells. The reason it's so important is have a look at what's happening, right? Little follicles that a female is born with, they develop under the action of which two hormones? What hormone stimulates a follicle, everyone? In its name. Just tell me the acronym.
FSH.
Very good, thank you. FSH. And where does that FSH come from now that you're all masters of that feedback loop? Close your eyes, think about where did it come from. Don't look at your image. Where did the FSH and LH come from? Anyone? Ed?
Pituitary gland.
Very good, from the pituitary gland, right? Because FSH is going to be stimulating the follicle, and eventually at day 14 of the cycle, I'm not going to, in fact, I think now is the right time to tell you all, but at day 14 of the cycle, do you remember the other hormone that comes from the pituitary? Rathania, what was its name? There was FSH, and there was another hormone that is released from the pituitary.
LH.
Very good. At day 14, it is a surge in LH that causes ovulation. So now you're starting to learn what all of these hormones do, right? So day 0 to day 14 of the female reproductive cycle, you'll get an increase in FSH that will stimulate follicles, right? This is free marks. The name is telling you what it does. Just remember what its name is, right? FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. And then at day 14, we'll have a surge in LH, which will be causing ovulation. Ovulation, day 14. Ovulation. Okay, so now you know what LH does, you know what FSH does. Good. Now have a look at what happens next. Remember, these are the lining cells of that follicle, and they go on to become hormonally active. So this little clump of lining cells is kind of retracted, it's got smaller. Can you all appreciate that? There's no egg inside, but it's still a hormone factory. The name of this hormone factory is the corpus luteum. So the exact structure in the ovary that releases estrogen and releases that other hormone we've yet to talk about called progesterone, it's released from the corpus luteum of the ovary, right? Here you're going to say releases estrogen plus progesterone. Okay, and even before that ova comes out, right? Even in this stage, which I'm showing you, those black lining cells are continually releasing estrogen and progesterone. Good. So far, you should know the feedback loop of which structures release which hormones and the negative feedback. And you should also know what LH does, FSH does, and what estrogen does as well. Estrogen will travel in the bloodstream from the ovary, and it will thicken the endometrium in preparation for implantation of those clump of cells that is the embryo. Do we have any questions about what the feedback loop is, LH, FSH, and estrogen? Very good. Good. So now we're going to start talking about progesterone. Okay. Now, looking at this image again, we said implantation happens in the wall of the uterus, right? So we also have the other side of the wall of the uterus here. And I want you to tell me, would you want the wall of the uterus to contract and crush against the developing embryo, or would you want to maintain the wall of the uterus in a relaxed position? What would be the ideal action of the uterine muscle layer during pregnancy? Do you want it to maintain relaxation, or do you want it to contract? Ed?
Maintain.
Good. So you want it to stay relaxed. Okay? And that's exactly what progesterone does. So I remember progesterone, it maintains pregnancy, and the way it maintains pregnancy is it prevents this muscle wall and this muscle wall from contracting inwards. Because if it did contract inwards, you would crush the embryo, and again, you'll have termination of pregnancy. And this leads you to medicine, because when an individual requests termination of pregnancy, the medication that doctors provide are anti-progesterones. They block progesterone. And if that happens, what will happen to the muscle layer of the uterus, everyone? It will contract. And very similarly, when you have a fetus that's fully developed, it's at 37 weeks, and you want the wall of the uterus to contract to deliver that fetus, what kind of drug would you give them? Would you give them a progesterone, an estrogen, an anti-estrogen, or an anti-progesterone? If you want to deliver a fetus that's kind of staying in the uterus longer than it should be. Come on, future doctors, what would you give? Let's go to Anne.
The anti-progesterone.
Very good. So as doctors, when we see a pregnant woman who's reached term, 37 weeks, she's gone to 40 weeks now, still hasn't delivered the baby, that's quite common, you'll give them an anti-progesterone, right? And that blocks what progesterone does, which maintains a relaxed uterus, and the uterus starts to contract, and that will move the fetus, the placenta, everything downwards for delivery, right? So it's the understanding of all of this which allows humans to be born, right? Before technology, before medicine, it was like 40% of women would die in pregnancy, and about 50 and plus percentage of pregnancies would not successfully conceive. That's why in hunter-gatherer days, after about reproductive age, historical records and the fossil record all show, and even DNA analysis shows, that women tried to conceive multiple times because it was such a low likelihood to actually have a healthy delivered baby, which is completely the difference now in the 21st century, where if you are pregnant, you more than likely will conceive and have a child because of all of this tech. Good. Does anyone have any questions so far? So now you should know what estrogen does, you should know what progesterone does, LH, FSH, and you should know that hormone feedback loop. Is everyone with me so far? Good. So now all of us are going to go through a little thought experiment. Thought experiments are what all great scientists do to reach new conclusions about the world, right? Even about the human body, it's the exact same thing we're going to be doing. Can you guys raise your hand if you do physics or you've heard about special relativity, or have any idea what special relativity is? Okay, well, in very brief, special relativity is a theory which tells us as we get faster and faster, closer to the speed of light, time slows down, lengths contract, and masses increase and approach infinity. You might think this sounds like some kind of made-up magic, right? You can actually stop time if you reach the speed of light, and time slows down the faster you move. But the famous scientist Einstein developed and discovered this theory just from asking himself a thought experiment. about moving trains. Those of you interested in physics, I would highly recommend you read that. I thought that was one of the most interesting things in science, full stop. So what we're going to do now is we're going to do a little thought experiment, similar to what Einstein did with physics, but in biology. Now, let's say that you have an individual and they are currently undergoing their reproductive cycle, and it is now day 14 of the female reproductive cycle. What will happen at day 14 with Anya? What process?
Ovulation.
Very good, right? So day 14 of the female reproductive cycle, you'll have ovulation. And who can tell me what hormones underneath the event? So here we have event. Underneath, we're going to talk about hormones as well. What hormone would have caused ovulation? Let's go to Matthew.
LH.
Very good. So there'll be a surge in LH, which causes ovulation. We'll talk about why LH and all of that surges. You might be wondering, why is that happening? We'll get to that. For now, I want you to just appreciate that is what happens. Okay. Now, one day after ovulation, this is when we reach a crossroads, because two things can happen. What two things are possible one day after ovulation, Edward? Tell me anything.
One day after ovulation, did you say?
Yeah. Yeah. What process can happen?
Fertilization.
Good. You can have fertilization. And what is the opposite event to that?
No fertilization.
Yeah, no fertilization. You don't form a zygote, right? And as you will understand, this pathway occurs 99% of the time. This pathway will occur usually 1% of the time in a female reproductive cycle. So just know that top arrow is very rare. Okay, it only happens if there is mating, if there is timing of the reproductive cycle. And to just give you even more facts, if we look at 100 couples trying to have a child, in 1 year, only 80 of them would be able to conceive and get pregnant, right? The other 20% of couples, after 1 year of trying, despite being completely healthy, despite having a completely normal reproductive cycle, they will still not be able to conceive. That's just to show you that it's not easy to conceive and have a child. And that top arrow is quite hard and quite rare to occur. Okay. Now, this is where things start to split up. Because if fertilization happens, a completely different set of events occurs compared to no fertilization. So I'm going to go to Matthew. Matthew, if fertilization happens, what will happen 7 days after this?
7 days after fertilization,
Yeah.
wouldn't mitosis occur, and it will go to the lining of the endometrium.
Very good. And what occurs at the lining of the endometrium? What's that process called?
Implantation.
Yes, good. That's what the examiner wants to hear, right? 7 days after, about 1 week after, you will have implantation. Okay. Now, this is where pregnancy has occurred, right? Because I'm sure you've all seen the movies where, a woman looks at a pregnancy test and she sees 2 bars and she goes, I'm pregnant. And that was from testing the urine. Now, let me tell you the exact hormone that the pregnancy test picks up. So whoever discovered or created the pregnancy test was an absolute genius, because they looked at this process and they were like, aha, I know what hormone gets released in pregnancy. I'm going to test for that. Created the technology. Now the whole world, 8 billion people use this to determine if they're pregnant or not, right? So the hormone that's measured in urine is released from the outer cells of this implanted embryo. And the hormone is called human, because obviously it comes from humans. Chorionic. Now, just a small tip, and this will help you a lot with your understanding of all these fancy words. Chorion means placenta, right? So human chorionic means the cells of this embryo, the outer cells, those are the cells that are going to go on to form the placenta. Hence why the hormone released from those outer clump of cells is a human chorionic hormone. Now, it's a hormone that changes or acts on the gonads. What do we call a hormone that's going to go and act on the gonads, everyone?
Is it a luteotropin?
Oh, close. Gonadotropin, right? It will change the gonads to gonadotropin. So the hormone is human chorionic gonadotropin. When they discovered it, the specific isoform was a beta form, right? So they call this hormone beta human chorionic gonadotropin, or in short, you don't need to know this whole name for your exams, beta HCG. This you definitely need to know. The acronym. Hormone is beta HCG, right? So when implantation happens, the hormone that those outer cells of that embryo releases are beta HCG. Now, where is it going to act? You know it's a gonadotropin. So, Alyssa, what structure do gonadotropins act on?
The gonad.
Good. And in a female, Alyssa, what is the gonad?
The sex organ, like
The ovaries, right? So what you see in this little diagram that I've drawn is that beta HCG is going back and it's acting on the corpus luteum. And remember, what did I tell you? Hormones are how structures talk to each other in the body. So beta HCG is basically this embryo saying to the ovaries, please keep on releasing estrogen and progesterone. I have successfully landed in the endometrium. I need you, the follicle in the ovary, to continually release estrogen and progesterone. And that is exactly what that structure does. This corpus luteum stays and it keeps releasing estrogen and progesterone until the placenta can take over. And after about week 8 of pregnancy, the placenta is what releases estrogen and progesterone. So in summary, let's take a step back and understand this. Day 14 of the cycle, we have ovulation. That's due to an LH surge. A day after that, we're going to have fertilization. If there was mating, if spermatozoa reached the outer 1/3 of the fallopian tube, as you see here. 1 week after that, as Matthew mentioned, we have implantation into the endometrium. And what hormone is released from implantation? Let's go to Atul. What was the name of the hormone that's released on implantation, Atul? Quickly. Beta HCG, right? Beta HCG is a hormone that is released on implantation. Okay? When I ask you guys questions, do be ready to unmute and answer, right? Because it keeps things interactive. Good. All right. So when we have beta HCG, what is that beta HCG going to do? So moving on to Edward, what did that beta HCG do?
Can't remember. Something with
Okay,
the corpus luteum.
Good, right? So the ovary continues to release estrogen and progesterone to continue the pregnancy, right? And could you remind the class, what does estrogen and progesterone do?
Estrogen thickens the endometrium, whereas progesterone maintains it.
Very good. And also prevents uterine muscle contraction. So that's what progesterone does. Very good. Good job, right? So that's what's going to happen if there was fertilization. So remember, the key difference in that pathway is we did have fertilization, so all of those things happened. Okay? Now let's talk about what happens if there was no fertilization. If there is no fertilization, Sarah, will there be implantation 7 days later? If a spermatozoa is nowhere to be seen, there is no zygote formed, will there be an embryo that is going to implant into the uterine wall?
No.
Perfect, right? So 7 days later, there will be no implantation. If there is no implantation, everyone, will there be the release of beta HCG? Let's go to Matthew. Matthew, will there be a release of beta HCG?
No.
Good. So there'll be no beta HCG. So let's write that down. No beta HCG. And what did beta HCG do? It went back to the ovary and it told that corpus luteum, that hormone factor releasing estrogen and progesterone, to keep on doing its job. But now, since there's no beta HCG, what happens is that corpus luteum, since it hasn't received any signals after 7 days, starts to shrink and forms a little scar that does not release any more hormones. Sad little dead follicle scar. No more hormones. So can everyone tell me what is now going to happen to estrogen and progesterone levels? Betania? Now there is no more hormone factor in the ovary. What will happen to estrogen and progesterone levels?
They'll drop.
Exactly. There'll be a decrease in estrogen and there'll be a decrease in progesterone. Now, something very interesting happens here, right? If there's a decrease in estrogen, what happens to the endometrial lining, Sarah? Does it thicken or does it thin and break down now that there's decreased estrogen?
It becomes thin and breaks down.
Exactly. It becomes thin and breaks down because estrogen thickens the endometrium. If you take that away, it's going to thin and break down the endometrium. And what did we say progesterone does, everyone? Progesterone prevents the uterine muscles contracting. Now that there's a drop in progesterone, everyone, what's going to happen? What happens to the uterine muscle? Let's go to, Anne?
They'll start contracting.
Very good. Now, you need to appreciate there are blood vessels. I want you to imagine the red dots that I'm showing you are blood vessels that are coming out of the page towards your face. So that's why they look like little circles, right? Now, what happens is, when the uterine muscle wall contracts, it's going to squish those blood vessels and make them very, very thin and stop blood flow. What happens when you stop blood flow? If I stop blood flow to my heart, what's happening? If suddenly there is a plaque that stopped blood flow to my heart, what am I suffering from right now? Anyone?
Is it stroke?
Heart attack. Heart attack. Right? What's affecting your heart? And if that happens to the brain, if you get sudden blockage of blood flow to the brain, you get a stroke. The brain starts to die. In a heart attack, since there's no blood to the heart starts to die. So now, since we've squashed, there's a drop in progesterone, the uterine muscle has contracted, and now there's no more blood flow to the uterine lining. What happens to the uterine lining, everyone? Just like a heart attack, just like a stroke, when you stop blood flow to an organ, what does it do?
Dies.
It dies, right? And guess what? The shedding of dead cells, of blood vessels, that is menses. That is the first day of menstruation. And so when that happens, it will start day one of the next cycle. And that is why menses happens. Okay, all of this is being recorded. I would highly urge you all to watch this again. You can put it on like 2x speed and just blitz through it. But in summary, you need to understand this flowchart. Ovulation happens at day 14 due to an LH surge. Sarah, what happens one day after ovulation? What two things can happen?
Fertilization or no fertilization.
Very good. And at all, if fertilization did happen, what occurs 7 days after that?
Implantation.
Very good. Implantation. And so, Alyssa, when implantation happens, what hormone is released?
Beta HCG.
Very good. And Edward, what does the beta HCG do?
One's the corpus luteum.
Good. In simple terms, it keeps estrogen and progesterone releasing in the ovary. That's what you need to understand as a band 6 student, right? You don't need to know the word corpus luteum. The key word here is when there is beta HCG, it tells the ovary to keep on releasing estrogen and progesterone. You'll get continuation of the pregnancy. Okay. Now, if there was no fertilization, Matthew, what does that mean 7 days later? Will there be implantation?
No.
Okay, so will there be any release of beta HCG, Matthew?
No.
No. So will there be a continued release of estrogen and progesterone?
No.
No, right? So the answer is no for everything. So, Anne, if you get a drop in progesterone, what will that cause? You don't need to mention the whole blocks blood vessels, stops. That's just for all of you to understand. But in your exams, all you need to say is the drop in progesterone causes shedding of the uterine lining, which is menstruation. Does that make sense? That is what you need to know for your exams. All the additional stuff is me explaining why. Because as a student of biology, you should always be asking, why does that happen? And when you truly understand something, you can answer all the whys. Does that make sense to everyone? Now, all of you should have questions at this point. Does anyone want to ask any questions at all? I had a ton of questions when I first learned this. No? All right. Hopefully I've done a good enough job that no one has any questions as of yet. Very good. Okay. Let's move up now. Actually, let's move down to this checkpoint here. Okay. I want you to have a look at this graph and tell me what's going on. What are you understanding about this graph? And before we do that, I'm just going to ask all of you, I'm just going to pick on us and ask us a few questions about that feedback loop flowchart that we had, because that's going to help us explain what's happening in all of these graphs. So, Sarah, what is the master control center in the brain that releases GnRH?
The pituitary gland.
Close.
No, the hypothalamus.
Yes,
Hypothalamus.
Hypothalamus releases GnRH, right? And that's going to travel to the structure, which is directly underneath. It's still in the brain that you mentioned, which is the pituitary. And Edward, what two hormones are released from the pituitary gland?
LH and FSH.
LH and FSH. Now, they're going to travel in the bloodstream really far away, and they're going to be acting on the gonad, which is an ovary, and causing the release of which two hormones? Let's go to Alyssa. What two hormones are released in the ovary by LH and FSH?
Estrogen and
Good. Estrogen, and then progesterone as well. Now, what does the estrogen do, Anne, that you need to mention back at the hypothalamus and pituitary?
It sends a negative feedback loop, so it stops producing LH and GnRH, which also reduces the progesterone.
And estrogen itself. And so that controls it in a very tight feedback loop, all right? And it's not necessarily that it will stop producing LH, FSH. It's just the more estrogen there is, the more estrogen will go and block the release of LH and FSH and decrease the increase, right? So what I mean by that is if there are, 100 units of GnRH released per second, 100 units of LH and FSH released per second, the estrogen will then go back and it will reduce that to about 80 units being released, and 80 units. And that will release less estrogen, and then estrogen will reduce its negative feedback, and that keeps on occurring, right? So in summary, estrogen and progesterone go back and they exert negative feedback, which reduces the amount of LH, FSH, GnRH released. They will still be released, but just in smaller amounts now. Okay, very good. So now all of you have about 2 minutes. I want you to extract as much information from this graph and try to explain it as much as possible. I'll give you 30 seconds to digest it, and then I'm going to give you a bit of help, and then we're all going to answer this graph together. 30 seconds, I want you to digest what is going on, because I'm going to ask a couple of you. Okay. Atul, I'd like you to start by breaking it down. So what do you see is going on here? What new information is this graph telling you, and what can you explain from your current understanding? So just give it your best go. And try being as loud as you can, because it's a little bit hard to hear you. But yeah, take it away.
I'm not really sure. What is corpus albicans?
That's just a scar. Corpus albicans is just that scar in which the follicle is now no longer releasing any hormones, right? Let's start at the very beginning. How do you know it's 0 days in the reproductive cycle? What's happening in the uterus? Look at the bottommost part, uterine cycle. What's happening?
Menses is decreasing.
Menses is occurring. It's not decreasing. The decrease you see is there's just a decrease in estrogen, which has made the thickness of the uterine lining much thinner because of the decrease in estrogen. Does that make sense? It's not that menses is decreasing. It's just that menses has started, and you see that because there is bleeding at the surface, and you see there is a decrease in thickness. All of this is sugar and water. All of this thickness, everyone, is just sugar and water caused by estrogen, right? So as there is a decrease in estrogen and progesterone, there's a decrease in thickness and there's shedding of the lining. That's what's occurring. Now, at this same time, what is going to be happening? Look at the right at our little feedback loop. There's going to be the release of GnRH, which is going to be releasing LH and FSH. Can everyone see that happening? Right? So LH is barely increasing. It's increasing ever so slightly. And don't worry about this dip and up and down of FSH. That's way to understand that is way too much depth. But all I want you to understand is there's a slight increase in LH and FSH, right? And what is that doing to the follicle? So at the ovary, what do you see is happening to the follicle? Everyone? Rithania, what's happening to the follicle as there's a slight increase in FSH? The green line. What's happening to the follicle?
It's growing.
Yeah, it's growing, it's maturing, right? Very good. Now, what's happening to estrogen this entire time? Estrogen started here. Because there's an increase in GnRH, there's an increase in LH, there's an increase in FSH. What is happening to estrogen levels slowly over time? Everyone? It's continually increasing. Can we all appreciate that? And so what happens is, even though there is negative feedback, as I mentioned, there's a slow, gradual increase in estrogen until about day 13. Can you all see that? At about day 13, all of this stops. Let me explain what happens at day 13. And this is the last bit of information you will need to understand to perfect your knowledge of hormones and pregnancy, right? Now, do you remember when in that little feedback loop graph, what I did? Let's go all the way back up to that graph and see what I wrote on that graph, right? What did I scribble out? What did I rub all this mess out? When I was taking you through the feedback loops, do you recall that I scribbled out the positive sign? And I told you all that rarely ever happens, where estrogen goes from negative feedback and instead exerts positive feedback. And that's what happens in this hormone graph, right? So coming all the way back down to this graph here. What happens is when estrogen reaches this level, what happens is it starts acting on different receptors in the brain. And it switches from negative feedback at the hypothalamus and pituitary to positive feedback. And the way you see that is when it switches from negative to positive feedback, what do you expect to happen to LH and FSH levels now? Everyone? If you switch from negative to positive feedback, yes, and what would happen to LH and FSH?
They would increase.
Exactly, and that is exactly what happens there. That spike in LH and FSH is caused by estrogen at day 13 hitting its threshold and switching from negative to positive feedback. Okay? And so that is why there is a surge in LH. As if you remember, I told you to memorize there is a surge in LH at day 14, but I never told you why. The why is because of that switch in estrogen from negative feedback to positive feedback. Okay? Very good. And then what happens, the estrogen will then start dropping down and go back to negative feedback. Now, at this point, ovulation has occurred because of that surge in LH, right? Now, in a normal reproductive cycle, Alyssa, where there is no fertilization, will there be implantation?
No.
Will there be the release of beta-HCG?
No.
No. So what you can all see is this hormone factory, which is continually releasing estrogen and progesterone. And that's why there's an increase in progesterone and an increase in estrogen after ovulation. Since there is no beta HCG, it breaks down. So I'm just going to write here, no fertilization. Therefore, there's no beta HCG, there's no implantation for it to be released. Since there is no beta HCG, that part of the ovary that releases the estrogen and progesterone degenerates into a scar. And it stops releasing estrogen, stops releasing progesterone. And what do you see happening to, first of all, number one, the thickness of the uterine lining, but also the integrity? You see it starting to shed as well. And that starts day one of the next cycle. Good. I know this is a lot of information, and let me just clarify to you, if they ever give you this table, which they can in your trial exams, if they did give it to you in your HSC exams, they'll guide you through it a lot. But I just want you to be familiar with this graph, right? You don't need to explain it from nothing, okay? They'll always guide you through this table. But I want you to just know why things are happening generally. You don't need to explain why everything goes up and down, but just the general trend of what's happening. So all of you should be able to explain that at day 14 there is a surge in LH. You need to be able to tell me that is what causes ovulation. You need to tell me that there is no beta HCG, which is what drops your estrogen and progesterone. You should be able to tell me it's the drop in estrogen and progesterone that causes menses. If you guys can do all of that for me, you understand this table well enough. Small thing, this is completely unrelated to HSC Biology. You don't need to know this for your exams, but a very interesting thing is that the way women who are struggling to conceive, the way they check whether they've ovulated is they measure their morning body temperature, and there's a little spike in body temperature when a woman ovulates. And so doctors recommend checking body temperature at day 14. If there is a small increase, that's when you know ovulation has happened, and so they can time having a child and increase their likelihood of conception. And question.
Yeah, I just had a question. Why does the estrogen levels drop at day 14?
Very good question. Why does it drop? It's because that positive feedback is very transient. So as soon as the estrogen exerts positive feedback, it goes back, and you can see it exerts massive negative feedback as well. And that drops the LH and FSH, and then estrogen also drops at the same time. Does that make sense?
Could you explain it again once more?
Yeah, no worries. Right. So your question is, why did the estrogen drop after day 13, right? And it's because once that estrogen hits positive feedback and spikes the LH and FSH, the LH and FSH start to drop, right? And since there's a drop in LH and FSH, there's less LH and FSH going to the ovary and causing a release of estrogen. And so estrogen also starts to plummet. So in fact, this graph is a little bit, in terms of timing of it, kind of increase to day 14 and drop with all the other hormones. But this graph is just slightly off axis.
Thank you. That
Good.
makes sense, yeah.
Good. Again, you guys will never be asked to answer questions like that. That's just more for you to understand. Like I said, the main things I'll ask from this kind of graph is explain what the surge in LH does, explain why progesterone and estrogen drops day 21 onwards, explain why menses occurs at day 0. That's the key things that the examiner would want to know. Okay, good. Any other questions from everyone? Please ask away. Good. I personally think this is one of the hardest concepts in HSC Biology. So if you understand this and you're comfortable with it, you'll be fine. Okay. Good. What we'll do is I'll let you all have your 5-minute break, digest all of this. We'll go through exam questions, and that will show you what you need to know for your exams. And then it'll kind of calm you down, because you'll be like, I don't need to know everything. I just need to know what estrogen does, what progesterone does, that feedback loop on the right-hand side. and you're more or less set for your exams. Okay, so take your 5-minute break. We'll recap at about 3:16. And I'll take you through the HSC Bio paper that my students had this year. Okay. All right. See you all at about 3:16, 3:17. Okay, when you're all back, you hit the raise hand icon. We'll jump back into things. Great, give me one moment. I will show you all the paper. As I promised, the 2022 HSC Biology exam. Let's have a look at it. Okay, hopefully you can all see it says a recording. But can you all see the text? Is it a little bit, I think it's a little bit blurry. Let me see if I can but I'll play it as we go and we'll have a look at what kind of questions they ask you. So all these questions are not bad at all. We'll see if there's any relevant questions to us. So as you can see, as soon as you get to question 5, they start asking you table data analysis questions rather than just straight, do you know this or do you not know this type of questions. Have a look at question 6. Question 6 is literally the same question I keep asking all of you, right? Which you now should be able to understand. What's the answer for 6? Can everyone read question 6? Anne, can you see question 6?
Yes.
Okay, I know it's a little bit hard, but we can all zoom in. The question is, where does implantation occur? Right? So, Tanya, what would your answer be to question 6?
D.
D, which you said is Z. Perfect, right? And what would you call that, Alyssa? What's that structure Z? What would its name be?
Sorry, I can't really see the question very well.
Oh, that's all right. So it's all these bunch of letters of different structures in the uterus. Now, after your implantation occurs, it occurs in Z, which is the lining of the uterus, the endometrium. Very good, right? You could do that. So all of you are at the stage to at least get 1 mark in an exam for HSC Bio. Again, table graph kind of question. This is about vaccination. There's no point in me going through the details. It's very module 7 heavy so far with the exam. But of course, you can all appreciate it's a lot of data analysis questions, which is why I need you to all get very confident in applying your knowledge rather than memorizing it. Let's go to, there you go, a DNA question, right? Let's see if I can make it a bit easier to see. Is it a little bit easier to see now, maybe? Right? Can people see this question? Short section of DNA, they're asking you what Z, X, and Y are. So Edward, what's X and Y in question 12?
Deoxyribose sugar and phosphate.
Very good. Easy, right? So let's move on to Z. What is Z? Matthew, do you want to give this one a go? What do you think Z is? So you've been shown the base above is cytosine, and there's 3 lines connecting cytosine to the next base. Underneath it is another very similarly shaped base called Z, and it's got 2 bonds to another base pair. Any idea what that is?
Would it be guanine?
Let me show you. See. Can everyone see that? So I'll like redraw over it, right? So 1, 2, 3, little square, long square, little square, 1, 2, long square. What is Z? So Matthew suggests it could be guanine. All right. Let's go to Alyssa. What do you think Z is, Alyssa?
Guanine.
Okay, so we've got 2 for guanine. Let's go to Atul. What do you think it is?
Guanine.
Okay, Atul's got guanine too. Sarah, what do you think it is?
Guanine.
Okay. Britannia?
Guanine.
You might be wondering, why Is he still going through asking more people? If 5 people have said guanine, surely he has to be right. Anne, what's your answer?
Also guanine.
And what does C bind to?
Guanine.
Okay. Now, they've asked you what Z is, right, which is the base underneath that. Can you see that C and Z are not bound to one another? Agree? C is bound to this base pair here, right? So straight away know that is your guanine. Cytosine binds to guanine. C binds to G, right? They're complementary bases. A guanine in this model, remember, what is a model? It's a visual representation, is a rectangle. They've asked you what this little square is. So it can't be guanine. That's the first thing. Can everyone appreciate that? Right? C binds to G. C is bound to a rectangle, and they've pointed at a square and asked you what that square is. Right? Now, the thing that gives it away is, look, this could be cytosine as well. But Ed, why is this not cytosine? Ed?
Because it's got two bonds
Very
instead of three.
good. Very good. If you've all seen the structure of DNA in enough detail, what you should understand is that an A binds to a T, a C binds to a G, because an A and a T have a specific number of bonds they can form. A C and a G have another specific number of bonds they can form, right? So C and a G form 3 bonds. The A and a T form 2 bonds. And even if you didn't know that, I should tell you, since there are a different number of bonds here versus here, this must be the other 2 base pairs, A and T. So this could be adenine, or it could be thymine. And if you look at the options here, the options are only thymine. That leads you to thymine as your answer. So the answer here was not guanine, it was thymine. Does that make sense to us? Again, we'll go through DNA structure in more detail. We haven't formally gone through it, but I went through it in the first lesson, hence why I wanted to run through this question. Can you all hit the raise hand icon if this makes sense to you? Good, 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 good. So hopefully you all start to understand what kind of questions you get asked in your exams, right? All right. Okay, and this is about mutation, but again, mutation is a bit beyond our pay grade at the moment. That's module 6. You can see pedigree questions, so you'll all learn that at the end of module 5. These are ways to track inheritance, and I'll show you how to answer them in a couple of seconds. They're very easy. Good, some chromosome questions. Again, these are all mod 6, so not relevant to you. More pedigree questions. That's about technology and disorders, the lenses question. And then here's is about kidney and dialysis, which is module 8. So none of that's relevant to us. But as you can all see, students would have never seen these questions before. They've never seen dialysis, blood flow kind of questions, right? But I will show you enough application of content that this stuff will all be very easy to you. Let's see if we can do any more of these HSC questions to us. Oh. Artificial pollination. This is a bit of mod 6, but you all understand normal pollination. So you should be able to tell me what artificial pollination is, right? It's when we as humans, we force pollination to occur. So what do you think it involves, Ritanya? Tell me the male and female reproductive parts of a plant and what I'll need to take from what to cause pollination. Ritanya, give it a go. What is the male reproductive part of a plant? Female transfer.
Is the male one an anther?
Good. And it contains a pollen, and we need to transfer it from the anther down what structure?
The stigma.
Good. That's the stigma. What else? We need to get down the stigma, style, and ovary, right? So an exam answer with this would sound something along the lines of artificial pollination involves using forceps to transfer pollen from the anther of one plant down the stigma, style, and ovary of another plant. Okay, so this is plant 1 and this is plant 2. This is exactly how you do it. Now, another point just to consider and mention is plants have male and female reproductive parts. Now, Anne, if we're trying to pollinate, we're trying to cross-pollinate plant 1 and plant 2, would you want plant 2 to pollinate itself as well?
Because it's cross-pollination, no.
Yes, exactly that. We're trying to cross-pollinate, right? So we don't want a plant to self-pollinate itself. We want the genetic information from parent 1, which we like, with parent 2. We don't want 2 of parent 2. So what we also need to do is get scissors and chop the anthers off the second plant. So Band 6 student would also mention that. That's a bit more Module 6 related, but just more things to consider mentioning in your exams. What is this? This has come up so many times, and all of you should understand this. Ed, tell me the difference between males producing spermatozoa and females producing ova. So you should know males, they start producing spermatozoa after puberty, and it takes on average about 70 days to produce new spermatozoa. And they're continually doing that to the end of life, right? Ed, when does a woman or a female have the most ova in their lifetime?
As a fetus.
It's a fetus. So when they're born, they have about 500,000. 1 million has already dropped down to 500,000 from the uterine period to birth. Then from birth all the way to 53, females carry over in the ovary where they're subject to degradation by chemical carcinogens that they eat. They eat charcoal or smoked foods. That's a carcinogen. It damages the ova. If you go to the Sydney, you go to Bondi Beach in the sun for 1 hour, that's 20,000 mutations in DNA, which further damages ova. And so by the age of 53, there are still ova present. A lot of them have been ovulated, but the ones that are present are too damaged and destroyed to conceive successfully. And so what you end up seeing is as women get older, right, if you look at this little flow chart here, understanding that as a woman gets older and older, the risk of chromosomal abnormalities goes from 1.5 to 1,000 to 13 1,000, right? Where it's so high likelihood of getting conditions like Down syndrome because the chromosomes and DNA of the ova are so damaged, right? So that explains why this happens, right? Females carry over throughout their entire life, so they also get destroyed through aging and radiation and other cell damage, whereas males constantly make new spermatozoa, so that issue is not as prevalent. So again, explain the trend shown in the data. So those of you who listened to when I was explaining all of these things versus your peers who would have never learned this, you'll be able to answer these questions quite easily, right? There you go. Compare the ways in which genetic variation can arise from sexual and asexual reproduction. 6 marks. This is your homework question for this week. I want all of you to message me that your answer to this question. So type it up, send it to me via messages. If you don't send it to me, I will ask you at the beginning of the class for your answer, your full answer. Okay, and I will be quite stern in the marking. So do type it up, send it to me. Ideally, as soon as class finishes, for those of you who are not doing chemistry after this, just quickly type up an answer to the best of your ability, plan your answer, and send it to me. But I want you guys to know, the exams, they rarely do this. This is not typical of a HSC Bio exam, to just give you a long response with no data, no stimuli, etc. Right? And what mistake would a Band 4 or 5 student make about plants when talking about asexual and sexual reproduction, specifically with self-pollination?
They would say that sexual reproduction needs 2 parents.
Very good. And straight away they'd lose a mark, right? And then the losing mark game would just go worse and worse from there, right? So very good. In fact, to very quickly answer this way, guys, Matthew, can you have genetic variation from asexual reproduction?
No.
No. So it's pretty much answers your question. Compare the ways in which genetic variation can arise from asexual reproduction. It can't arise from the asexual reproduction. It can only arise from other ways, which you will learn in Module 6. Things like mutation, which is not related to the reproduction process itself. Whereas sexual reproduction, we do have variation. And Alyssa, what cellular division process allows variation to happen in sexual reproduction? Alyssa?
Meiosis.
Very good. So then you just go into your own spiel about meiosis. Variation happens in sexual reproduction because of meiosis. In meiosis, there are 3 different ways that variation occurs that causes genetic variation. This includes crossing over, random segregation, independent assortment. So those are things we're all going to learn later. But as you understand, you did not understand genetic variation is the difference between sexual and asexual. Your entire answer to the 6 marker would just be poor form. Okay, good. Good. This is an experiment. So they're telling you about some indigenous plant that's used to treat sore throat, and they're asking you to do an experiment to see how good that medication works. Here's another question about cervical cancer screening. Now, I went through this in so much detail with my graduated class, but just to very quickly explain it to you all, 2 points from this. 1 point is you may have never seen a question about cervical cancer before, and so this will be all new information to you, and all be application of knowledge. For those of you who pay attention to the little small bits of information I add on that I tell you it's not in the syllabus, but it's important to know, this is one of them, and it's that cancer is usually caused by aging. It's usually caused by mutation due to various causes. Now, very rarely, bugs can cause cancer. Infectious disease can cause cancer, right? So unlike sunlight, which causes melanoma, there is a virus called the human papillomavirus, or HPV. And all of you, especially the females, would definitely be vaccinated against it, right? But what HPV does is it goes and infects the cervix, which is the lower part of the uterus, and it destroys the cervical cells, and they get so damaged that there is increased mitosis to repair the cells that are dying at the cervix, and you get cervical cancer. So in summary, HPV virus causes cervical cancer, and this is what they're showing you, how our screening program, which checks for HPV, has lowered the prevalence and incidence of cervical cancer in women. These questions are fine. DNA replication, right? Models, DNA replication, this is all directly relevant to you, but we haven't gone through that yet. Process of DNA replication, some of you should already be able to answer this question because you would have gone through it at school. More graphs and tables, all application, 5 markers. And as you can imagine, the questions just become more and more and more application based as you go through the paper. We haven't even completely finished it, but I'm just going to quickly skim through it. Tables, graphs, infectious disease, mutations, more application questions. But yeah, very good. Any questions about the biology exam in general? I really wanted to go through it in depth to show you the type of exam you will be sitting 360 days from now. Anyone have any questions at all? Good. Right, in that case, let's go to share screen and we'll continue. Let me find a question for you all to try doing. Again, this is a bit too additional. Question 4. Like I said, these are the kinds of questions they ask you about the first stop point. So when you got an answer to question 4, hit the raise hand icon and we'll move on. So all of you are going to get access to this booklet as well. It's being sent to you right now, so all of you will get it sometime this coming week. But 2020 exam choice, I just read 2020 exam choice question 4. Hit the raise hand icon once you have got an answer. Good job, Ed. Wait for a couple more people to get an answer for question 4. Good. Nathaniel? Good. This has got an answer. Atul, what's your answer? Walk us through. What have you selected so far? What are you thinking? Just your thought process.
So it says it has no cell wall.
Good. So what can you cancel out? Do bacteria have a cell wall?
Bacteria do have a cell wall.
Good. And they're also prokaryotic, so that straight away cancels that out. Do fungi have a cell wall at all?
Yeah.
Good. So you can cancel fungus out. And so this is the final thing, right? When you have an option that you've never heard about versus an option you know and fits the picture, you definitely want to pick the option that you know, right? So, Atul, have you learned anything about viruses yet?
About meiosis?
Virus.
Oh, about viruses? No.
No, right? Viruses are, in fact, they're non-living. So there wouldn't be cells, they wouldn't be called eukaryotic, prokaryotic. So by default, your answer is A, right?
Yeah.
So remember I told you, well, what is a protozoa? Let's go to Rithania. Rithania, how would you describe a protozoa to me? So if you're calling me, you're one of the doctors at hospital, you're calling me about a bug that you found in a patient's scan, how would you describe a protozoa to me?
I was just thinking it's a single-celled organism, but
Very good. That's the other thing. So you'd say it's unicellular, eukaryotic, no cell wall. Now it's straight away no. This is a protozoa we're talking about. Very good. Good. Let's go on to the next point. Question 8. Hit the raise hand icon once you've got an answer. I think for the rest of today, we need to go through exam questions, because what I find is when I take you all through too much content, not enough questions, we start focusing on the nitty-gritty details way too much and not on the application side of things. So let's spend the rest of today going through a couple of exam questions to get confident on what they ask you for the HSC trials and the exams. Good. Very good. So let's go to Edward. What's your answer,
D.
Very good. A base, a sugar, and a phosphate are the repeating units in DNA. So the answer is D. See, these questions are quite easy once you understand the key things you'll need to know. There you go. What did I tell you? They will ask you about the sites of all of these processes, right? This is free marks once you understand what's going on rather than memorizing. So again, question 21, A and B. Once you guys have written this in your books, you don't need to copy the questions. Please don't, because you're going to get the booklets. Just write exam choice 2020 question 21. And write your answers for 21A, 21B. And once you've done so, hit the raise hand icon. Okay? Good. Get some water. All right. Okay, how do we go? So let's go to Alyssa. Alyssa, what's the site of fertilization?
The fallopian tube.
Sorry, a bit louder.
The fallopian tube.
Good, fallopian tubes. Rithania, what's the site of development of the egg?
Ovary.
Very good, right? So even though I never asked you that question, since you paid attention to what goes on in terms of timeline, when I showed you that diagram, you understood that very well. Site of implantation of the embryo. I want one word. And what one word are you telling me?
The endometrium.
Very good, nice. And Matthew, good, you guys are killing it, nice. Matthew, next question, 21B. What is the role of progesterone in the female reproductive system? It's 2 marks, so try to say 2 things if you can. But yeah, what is it?
Sorry, I can't see question B. What was question B again?
One role of progesterone.
To maintain the lining of the uterus or the endometrium.
Very good. Maintains the lining of the uterus. Remember, it's 2 marks. So what's the second thing you want to say?
I don't know.
Anyone want to help us out? What's the second role of progesterone?
It prepares the endometrium for pregnancy.
That's kind of what Matthew said, but in another way, right? It maintains the endometrial lining, which is what happens in pregnancy. I know this question is asking you for one role. So to answer this question specifically, you would say progesterone is released from the ovaries and is responsible for maintaining the uterine lining. That would be fine. So the role and where does it come from? But what's the other role? It's very important.
Would you say to stop contractions?
Exactly, right? Remember what I told you all. Remember the examples I gave you. Anti-progesterones cause uterine contraction. Progesterone stops uterine contractions. You do not want that to happen too early because you'll get miscarriage or termination of pregnancy. And you want to give anti-progesterones if pregnancy is not and delivery is not occurring, because that will cause contraction of the uterus and expulsion of the fetus. Very good. Good job. All right, next. I'll give you all a bunch of other questions too. Question 1. And question 2. Look at this. Too many relevant questions for us. So when you got question 1 and 2, can you hit the raise hand icon? Good. For a couple more people to get an answer for 1 and 2. Good. Edward, what's your answer for question 1?
A.
Okay. So why did you cancel out B, C, and D?
From B, they don't undergo meiosis.
C?
C, bacteria is not eukaryotic.
D?
And D, it's not correct either.
Guys, well, why is D not correct? Because you need to clearly cancel out every option, right? So the 2 cells produced are genetically identical. That's true. And something is wrong with this statement. Only 2 cells are needed for offspring to be produced. It's not only 2, only 1. right? Because like one cell will elongate and form two cells. That's why D is not right. Okay, good. What about 2? Question 2, let's go to Sarah. What's your answer?
C.
Okay. Anne, what do you think?
I also put C.
Matthew, what about you?
B, because estrogen actually increases the lining, whereas progesterone maintains it.
I would agree that B is a better answer. And this is why some of the times in biology, the question is very vague. And so the issue is finding the best answer. Now, A is not right. We'll talk about what oxytocin is at the end of this lesson as well. D is not right because that causes ovulation. It has nothing to do with actual preparing mammalian tissue for pregnancy. This is all you have to think about what estrogen and progesterone do. Now, like I told you, the main thing progesterone does is it prevents uterine contractions. The other additional side thing it does is it maintains the endometrial lining. That doesn't prepare it for pregnancy, because if the endometrial lining is thin and progesterone maintains that thin lining, it's not prepared for pregnancy. Whereas estrogen, it thickens the endometrial lining and directly prepares it for pregnancy and implantation. If it's not thick, you will have no pregnancy, right? So I'd say the best answer would be B. This is where you need to kind of talk it out to yourself and think, what is the best answer compared to B and C? So I would say B is the best answer. Does that make sense to everyone? Good. I know both of them do. Both of them prepare reproductive tissue for pregnancy, but this question is so vague, so you need to find the best answer. Good. Question 3. Very quickly. Rithania, when you're ready, tell me the answer. Rithania, whenever you're ready, just get started on it. What do you think the circle is?
Is it the no.
Close. It's the base, right? So in DNA, you have your letters A, T, G, C, which are the bases. Now, I went through this at the very beginning of the first lesson, so if you want, go back and watch the recording for that. That's going to be connected to this unit here. And what is a square? Any ideas, Anne? Got 2 options left.
Oh,
What would
sorry,
you think?
was the sugar?
Yes, it's the deoxyribose sugar. And that's what gives DNA the DNA name, right? Deoxyribonucleic acid, because this entire unit is acidic in nature, and it's called a nucleotide, so nucleic acid. And the sugar is a deoxyribose sugar. And finally, you have your phosphate, which is chemically PO43-. You can just call it that. Very good. So your answer should be A. 3 marks for that. Good. Now, I might give you one more question, and then I will move on to telling you the final hormones, not in pregnancy, but in delivery, that they also like to ask. 1, 3, and 5. Let's go. All relevant to you guys. So you have exactly 2.5 minutes to tell me your answer to 1, 3, and 5. So hit the raise hand icon once you've got it. I want you to be fast because for the first couple of questions in your exam, it should take you seconds to do it. It's only question 20, question 16 to 20 that take minutes each to do. And that's why on average you should do a question every 1.5 minutes or 1.8 minutes. Matthew, question? Or have you done all of them?
Oh no, I just done the number 3.
Good. I want you guys to do 1, 3, and 5. Good. So hit the raise hand icon once you've got an answer. Okay. Atul, do you have a question?
Yeah, which questions are we supposed to do?
All of them. 1,
Okay.
3, and 5.
Okay.
So this is from the 2020 QATS paper. Just shut that down. And finished or question?
Finished.
Good. Does anyone know coding in this in our class? Even the basics, or has gotten some exposure to coding, computers? Okay. Well, year 12 is a hard time to do it or start it, but I would highly, highly recommend you. One of my biggest regrets in my life is now I'm approaching my mid-20s, and I wish that when I was your age, I'd sat down and at least exposed myself to coding and computers, because it allows you to automate and scale anything you do versus manual labor and work, right? You could potentially create a program that controls all the lights in your house instead of manually having to do that. Very similarly, in medicine, there are so many applications of coding and artificial intelligence that doctors don't know how to fix. And so we need to outsource to other people who can. And first of all, it saves a lot of lives, because when you have really good electronic systems and code and documenting patient records, doctors make less mistakes. And also, from a financial point of view, you will be substantially rewarded by society because you can do something that very few other people can. If you guys are really, really interested in some of the secrets and doing really well, even in the medical field, I'd highly recommend you just YouTube Coding 101, and you'll see like MIT OpenCourseWare or Harvard course on YouTube. And if you can get yourself to sit down for even half an hour and get started, if you do that for 5 years, you will be incredibly successful in whatever you do, in whatever field you're in. So maybe make that your little homework over the summer holidays. All right, coming back to this. What's your answer for question 1? Advantage of internal fertilization. Let's go to Sarah. What did you pick?
I picked D.
Good. C is not right. You need more care because it's developed inside the mother's reproductive cavity, and so it needs a lot of nutrients. It needs a placenta. It can't take place. It can take place, but it's not an advantage of internal fertilization. And a greater number of offspring are not produced. 1 is so good. Question 3. Anne, what's your answer?
I put B.
Good. Budding is asexual, no genetic variation. 3 marks, right? A is meiosis. C is sexual reproduction. D is not true. I told you all the organelles would jump into that little bud there. Okay, so 3 marks again. 5, ovulation, right? So I told you, once you understand what's normal in medicine, we apply that to abnormal. And so the examiners here are testing, did the student really think when they learned stuff, or did they just memorize and rote learn, right? So infertility can be treated by increasing the chance that ovulation will occur. Which hormone stimulates the maturation of follicles, right? They're not saying which one stimulates ovulation. And if they did, Edward, what would your answer be? Ask you, what hormone stimulates ovulation?
Wait, just for the question.
Not for this question. If I asked you which hormone stimulates ovulation, what would you say?
Luteinizing hormone.
Very good. And Matthew, to answer this question, what's your answer?
A.
Good. Follicle stimulating hormone. And if I was to ask you which hormone is detected on pregnancy tests, Anne, what would you pick? It's not here, but what would you pick? Say.
Beta HCG.
Perfect. Very good. Good job. Now, in the last minute, the last hormone I'll talk to you all about is the hormone oxytocin, right? So as we said, this is your brain, your spheres of the brain, that's your cerebellum, your brain stem. Brain's a beautiful organ, so complex. So you have your hypothalamus right in the center of your brain. Then underneath it, you have this little sac-like structure, which is your pituitary. Oxytocin is released from the back of the pituitary. It travels in the bloodstream, and it causes uterine contractions. When would you all want uterine contractions to occur, everyone? You wouldn't want it to occur during pregnancy. When would you want uterine contractions to occur? Not in the start, not in the middle. So by default, at the end, right? So the last little point I'm going to add is oxytocin released from the pituitary gland. It stimulates uterine contractions that cause labor and delivery. Labor, everyone, is just the onset of uterine contractions that ends in delivery. Okay, that's what labor is. Okay, very good. Well, that ends it for today. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, so final thing is, most of you, or I think all of you, should be getting your physical copy of notes. If you haven't followed the Google Forms steps, you will not receive your notes, so you will need to contact me ASAP for that. But for those of you who have sent your Google form and completed those details, and you've let your parents know, you'll be receiving the notes via postage. Okay? Good. All right, have a good week, guys. I will see you next week, and I'll see some of you now in chemistry.
Sir?
Yeah.
Could I please talk to you after class?
Sure. Feel free to stay back. All right, see you guys. Bye.
Okay.
Bye. So how can I help? Let me just stop the recording as well. One sec.